12 this morning. Mark chapter 10, verse 1, getting up, he went from there to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again, and according to his custom, he once more began to teach them. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female, and for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." In the house, the disciples began questioning about this again, and he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery." I bring you this morning to Mark chapter 10, and I know it's kind of odd, some of the songs we sang this morning, but it's actually very befitting, quite frankly. We're reminded of the freedom that we have in this country, and there are certain rights and privileges that we have because we live here. And there are certain things in this land now that are being discussed and debated as whether or not there is option. And this morning we're going to talk about the very first institution by God, and that is the institution of marriage. And this is not like some other kind of Christian doctrine that we hold to. This is a universal. This is a different category of issue that we deal with when we come to this particular truth. This is a truth that is binding upon every human being that lives upon this earth, no matter what tribe, tongue, nation, whatever you belong to. This is God's order. And so therefore it is non-optional. This is God's design. And this is one of those universals then we uphold as believers, no matter where we are, no matter what land we live in, we uphold this truth. Now I remind you that Jesus is giving a series of passion predictions. This is his second one that he gives. Following each one, we have a response by the disciples, and again has to do with their misunderstanding, and then there's teaching in regards to discipleship. This next series of messages I would put under this heading, "On the Way," because that is really what is happening. In chapter 10, verse 1, we have that they went from there through the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. We find them on the move in verse 17, "And as he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up to him and knelt before him." Verse 32, "And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus is walking ahead of them, and they were amazed." We continue to see Jesus moving towards, finally, his entrance into Jerusalem. Verse 46 of chapter 10, "And when they came to Jericho, and he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road." Chapter 11, verse 1, "And they approached Jerusalem and Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives." So there is this overriding emphasis that comes in chapter 10 of their movement towards Jerusalem. They are on the way. And this is such a very befitting overall thought that rides over through this section because of all the elements that Jesus is going to deal with. But he is going to pass through Judea, and on this journey he's going to lead him towards Jerusalem. But this, in a sense, symbolizes the theme of discipleship. Jesus is on the way. He is moving in a particular direction, and he is challenging others to come and follow him. As Jesus nears Jerusalem, his teaching about his mission and claims and discipleship become increasingly specific. We saw with the first passion prediction, as we moved through them and we get to the third one, we are going to find they become even more specific and more detailed, and even the teaching becomes even more detailed, and especially in light of this section as he deals with different relationships through here, he's going to get very specific and what it means to be a disciple and the different realms in which we are to live out our role as a disciple or a follower of Jesus Christ. While on this journey, Jesus is going to deal with several things. First, the problem of divorce. And really what he's going to do is he's going to change the discussion. It's not going to be about divorce, it's going to be about marriage. And he's going to point out to the religious leaders they're looking in the wrong passage. They need to go back to the beginning, how God first instituted it and God's order and design for things. Next, he's going to deal with the blessing of children, answering a rich man a question about eternal life, discussion with his disciples about the problem of wealth and blessing of serving the gospel, the problem of seeking position, prestige among the disciples. These are just some of the issues that Jesus is going to deal with. But what we find here is that he is dealing with the issue of discipleship in various segments of society and life in which we can find ourselves conducting life, whether it's marriage, whether it's children, whether it's riches or wealth or possessions, whether it's dealing with leadership, especially in light of the kingdom of God, or whether the physically handicapped, and Mark is going to end this section on this particular fact, where Jesus is going to heal blind Bartimaeus, and Bartimaeus is going to put his trust in Jesus, that he is able to recover his sight by the power of Christ, and he is going to desire to follow Jesus Christ and be an ideal disciple in chapter 10, verse 52. What we find in this section is discipleship is called upon in every dimension of life. We have no trouble being a disciple when we're at church. We have no trouble being a disciple when we're around other believers. But what about all the other dimensions? And what about in the household? We are still to be disciples of Christ. And sometimes that relationship with Christ calls upon us to do certain things in the context of marriage, or in the context of raising or being around children, or in the context of our own possessions and wealth. So Jesus is going to get a little more specific as far as what it means to follow him and how that should look in our lives. So I bring you to chapter 10, verse 1, to the setting. And this is interesting because there are two elements here that I want to point out to you. The first is the geographical setting. And I've reminded you before as we've walked through Mark's gospel that the geographical locations are not insignificant, they're very significant. What's interesting is that if we've been following along the geographical notations up to this point, we have found that actually the notations that come going all the way back to chapter 7 into chapter 10 verse 1 are all mentioned in chapter 3 verse 8. The influence of Jesus' ministry was to such an extent that all these people were coming from these different regions, and we find that Jesus actually is going to then pass through these various regions. You have people from Tyre and Sidon who come to see Jesus in chapter 3. Finally, he's going to pass through that region in chapter 7. And here we find him again passing through Judea and going beyond the Jordan in chapter 10 verse 1. All of these geographical notations tell us something very specific. They highlight the universal significance of Jesus' ministry. How do they do this? Because he is going to receive both Gentiles and Jews, as we've seen. Go all the way back to chapter 3, verse 8, and on in through this section, the different regions that he's gone through. He's also gone to both Gentiles and Jews, and he's taught both of them, and he's taught the crowds that have come from these areas to hear him speak. He has availed himself to everyone. In other words, it's highlighting the significance of his ministry that is going to be a universal one. Other gospel writers do it in a very specific way. Mark helps us see it in a very subtle way, but it continues to grow and to progress. If you look at the passion statements as they develop, each one that's given, there are new details that are added. One thing is hinted at, and the second one is going to be developed more fully in the third one. And all of the passion predictions, we find that the universal guilt of humanity is very clear. Everyone is going to be found responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. Jesus was rejected both by the Jews and the Gentiles. He was condemned to death by the Jewish Sanhedrin as well as by Pilate, who was a Gentile. These things are subtle, but yet they are very clear and there for us if we start to put together these clues. But we see this movement happening, and this is very befitting for us to make an awareness of this fact, because now he's moving towards Jerusalem. Here is going to come the climax of all that he has been doing. The great universal salvation is going to become a reality because Christ is going to fulfill his work upon earth. And he will assume for himself the role of Messiah completely, so that Peter can declare in Acts 2 that he is the Lord and the Christ, because he has fulfilled his work. But the other thing that's interesting about this verse in chapter 10, verse 1, is the issue of his ministerial setting. We have found Jesus going back to chapter 1, teaching in synagogues. He's taught in the open air in chapter 4, verse 1. He is taught in houses, and I put in-house here because at times it's referred to as he is in a by quality a house. We don't know what house it was, and other times it is in the house in Capernaum. But nonetheless, there was private discussion and teaching that would go on within the context of the house. We have two elements here. We have Jesus in open air ministry in chapter 10, verse 1. And here he's going to interact with the Pharisees. But notice with me, then in chapter 10, verse 10. In the house, the disciples began questioning about this again. This was a time of private instruction that was going to come for the disciples. They needed to understand this. Remember, keep in mind that they were raised in a very Jewish context. They were from a Jewish background, and therefore they had a Jewish understanding of marriage and divorce. And in those days, it's not how we would think it would be in light of the fact that they had the Old Testament. Their views were very different. But nonetheless, we find Christ carrying on the ministry of teaching. And in the midst of this, we find that he is going to be tested. Chapter 10, verse 2, some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. The encounter comes, the Pharisees, they are going to come out from the crowd. They are going to come face to face, and this is indicated by the preposition that's prefixed to this word. They're going to come face to face with Jesus, and they're going to have inquiries, and they want to know if it is lawful for a man to divorce a wife. What's significant here is that the term Pharisees is without the article, which indicates that this was not the official group of Pharisees. This was just a few individuals from the area of Perea that gathered together. They heard Jesus teaching, and they decided to step forward, and they were going to test him, and they were going to try to ensnare him and trap him. And obviously they had an understanding of what his view was in regards to marriage. But there is an element of hostility here in the term that is used, testing. This actual term is used in chapter 1 in regards to Satan when he tempted Christ. It is going to be used a couple other times in regards to the Pharisees and the religious leaders testing Jesus. This was not a positive thing, it was a negative thing. They came hostile to him, and they wanted to entrap him by what he said. And they wanted to do it in front of the crowds. You see, they wanted to be able to say, see, you can't listen to this guy because he's contrary to our teaching. And the reality of it is, he was contrary to their teaching, especially in this issue of marriage. So the question comes, and in Mark, it's interesting because Mark gives us the motivation that they came to test him, to entrap him, to ensnare him. But the absolute articulation of this question implies that they suspected that Jesus opposed divorce under no circumstance. You just do not get divorced at all. They understood that with Christ, and likely the way that this is posed, that there was no exception clause in his mind when it came to the issue of divorce. This is pretty powerful stuff, and Jesus is going to deal with them, and he's going to challenge them to the scriptures, but he's going to take them back further than they want to go. Marriage and divorce in Jesus' day are just like today. They're an issue of concern and controversy. And there are different reasons. In those days, there were two different schools, Shammai and Hillel, and they had two different views on the issue of divorce. Shammai believed that you only divorce a wife in regards to unchastity. In other words, if there was immorality, you had right to divorce her, but no other reason whatsoever. Hillel, though, the school of Hillel, believed that you could divorce your wife for anything. So they have reference to the fact if she spoils your meal, right? If she burns your toast, get rid of her. Find someone else who can cook for you. There were no restrictions with the Hillel school as far as divorce went. And so this is the debate. The issue wasn't whether one could or could not. The issue was what were the reasons for it really in their minds when they debated this issue. In other words, in their minds, they didn't think that there was not an issue of divorcing someone. You had right to do that. The question is, what were the grounds for it? This is an issue for us today. We deal with this. We don't want to, but it's a reality in the church that we have to deal with these issues. And some for differing reasons. At times, it's for the issue of unchastity, yes? Other times it's for silly things, and we try to spiritualize it. I remember one Christian singer, well known, she was divorcing her husband because he was hindering her Christian walk. Really? You're going to spiritualize something that God himself condemns and hates? Right? I mean, seriously. Just at least tell the truth if you're going to do it. Sometimes it's not for those things. Sometimes you're tired of just working on the relationship. Sometimes you feel like your back is to the wall and you have nowhere else to go. I just don't know what to do anymore. You see, it's not changing. It's not getting better. What do I do? And all of a sudden you think, there's got to be some way out. You see, we wrestle with this issue for all different reasons, and it's not always the same. And oftentimes when we hear the issue of divorce, all of a sudden in our mind we come up with reasons why some would or would not. But see, Jesus isn't even going to dabble with that. He's not going to even discuss whether or not it's permissible or not permissible. He's just going to go back to God's intent. And that's really where we need to go when we begin to discuss this. But for the Jews, they always went to Deuteronomy 24. And Deuteronomy 24 would seem like it was a pretext, or I will use the word proof text, for divorce, that it was legal and lawful and it was okay to do this. But let me set some groundwork for Deuteronomy 24 so we understand just what it was for. The intent of Deuteronomy 24, I'll give you several guidelines as you think about this particular passage. One, it discouraged hasty divorces by requiring a man to stipulate a reason for divorce in writing. In other words, it was not going to make it easy, but if it was going to happen, it had to happen in a certain way. Number two, it prohibited him from remarrying his divorced wife. The certificate of divorce guaranteed the divorcee at least a degree of dignity and the right to remarry another man if she chose. Number four, it safeguarded the rights of the woman as much as possible in a patriarchal culture. Remember, so much was dependent on the husband and the man, and for a woman to be on her own without a spouse, to watch over and care for and protect her and provide for her means, it left her without anything. So it safeguarded her as much as possible in a patriarchal culture, although divorcee entailed a stigma. Even priests were forbidden to marry someone who had been divorced. And a man in a second marriage defiled a man's first wife, thus making it impossible for him to remarry her. There was a stigma that went with it. Ultimately, Deuteronomy 24 was not intended to encourage divorce, but rather attempted to preserve a composed ruling in the unfortunate event of divorce. It is not what God intended nor desired. But if it was going to happen, then there were certain stipulations that had to be followed for the nation of Israel. But Deuteronomy 24 was not teaching that you should. And the reality of it is, when we find Jesus, we find Him responding to them. We see for them, Deuteronomy 24, it no longer limited these ill effects of divorce. For them, it became a pretext or a proof text for divorce, that it was okay, but Jesus is going to respond to it in a different way. And He was going to respond in the sense that this is not conclusive. When you're talking about marriage and divorce, this is not where you go. This is not where you start if you're going to discuss the issue. Where you start is all the way back at the beginning. But He reminds them the whole reason why this command was given was because of the hardness of your heart. It's because you were sinful. This term, scleros, where we get multiple sclerosis from, you see, it's because of your immoral condition that this concession was made. And just understand this. The concession was made. Basically, what Jesus is going to do in verse 5 and following, as He points out their hardness of heart, and He's going to teach them about the real issue of marriage, He's going to point out the fact that they were completely insensitive. They were insensitive to the call of God in regards to an unselfish love in marriage. And they were refusing to accept God's higher view of marriage, and they were going to embrace their own view of marriage. This is part of our problem in the church. We allow man to define what marriage is. No, God defines what it is because God is the one who instituted it. It's not left to a government. It's not left to us. It's left to God. So I don't defend the sanctity of marriage because this is something that I instituted or that somehow this is a good idea among other ideas. No, this is the standard, the order, the norm that should exist in society as Jesus defines it here. And it is a universal. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, the truth is the same. And it's just as binding. I believe. Jesus in verse 6, he's going to say, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. This term but is going to introduce the contrast between their view of marriage and God's higher intention. See, the problem with them is they're starting in the wrong place. They're dealing with Deuteronomy 24. It was a text of concession, not a text of intention. You see, if you want to talk about marriage and divorce, well, let's go to where it all started from. Let's go to where God established it, and let's go to the text of intention, not concession. Edwards makes this statement, the exceptional measures necessary when a marriage fails are of no help in discovering the meaning of intention of marriage. In other words, you don't go learning how to fly an airplane by reading the instructions for a crash landing. You hear what I'm saying? But see, we take the discussion to the same place instead of going back to the beginning. I've always appreciated any time I've ever seen my dad do a wedding, and he did ours, and he said, marriage is not an option. And if you cannot embrace the intent that God had for marriage, then this ceremony ends right here. It's amazing the things that we do with God's Word and how much we alter it for the sake of, and usually it's for the sake of our own sinfulness. We are handing things away to the world. We have handed Genesis 1 away to the world. When we embrace the fact that there is a thing as theistic evolution, and we do this because we say, well, it's the only way to reach the world. And that's really part of the reason why there was a move from taking this literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and saying, let's amalgamate it with the rest of the world and their view of evolution. Let's put the two together so that somehow we have a tool by which we can minister to them. We have to have a foothold into their life. So what are we going to do? Hand away the truth? The reality of it is, as Jesus quotes these passages, he is affirming the historical truth of Genesis 1 and 2. But see, we hand this away too. When we say that divorce is an option, and I understand it's tough. I'm just telling you, there are times where I've had to counsel a wife to say, you need to stay with your husband. And I'm telling you, some of the situations, from my humanity, run and run far and fast. But what's been my counsel? What does God say? You don't go. You'll work it out. Because what is God's intent? And the truth of it is, we go back to chapter 8. Take up your cross and follow me. We all have the responsibility to take up our cross and follow in obedience to Christ. Well, the circumstances are going to be different in all of our lives, right? Your marriage may be good, but so-and-so's may not be so great. But that's a part of the journey that God has for them. Yes? As hard as it may be. So even when Jesus comes and he highlights the truth of God's intent for marriage and that, it's still not necessarily easy. We all understand this, those of us who are married. It's not a piece of cake. Jesus isn't even going to talk about the issue of possible exceptions. He's just going to recover God's will on this. I wish we'd do more of this as the church. I wish we'd do more of this. That we would recover God's will for things rather than looking for the exceptions. See, look at me. In our sinfulness, we're always going to look for the exception. We're always going to look for the concession. We're always going to look for the easy way. Yes? You cannot have any relationship without an issue of commitment. I see people who come to the church, and it doesn't matter what relationship it is, marriage or otherwise. You see people come to the church, and they have one foot in and one foot out. You can't build a relationship that way. If somehow that's an option to leave, or when things become more convenient for me to go somewhere else, then I'm going to go, then how do you build a relationship on that? This is why you start a marriage with a prenup? Seriously? You've got one foot in, one foot out. How are you going to build unity out of that? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's either all in or you're not in. And this is how Jesus is going to define it. Jesus appeals to a prior, more fundamental authority in the order of creation. At the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. I love this apa. From the beginning and all through time, it will always be this way until the consummation of all that God is doing. This is the design. I have made them male and female. So as Jesus appeals to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 and 2:24, he indicates very clearly that marriage is God-ordained union between one male and one female. You see, it's not the government defines it. It's not we who defines it. It's God who defines it. That's His order for things. Anytime that we alter God's order of things, this is where the mayhem comes in. And this is true in all of our lives, and we all can testify to this, yes? Every time we step outside of God's norm, outside of God's order, outside of God's design, mayhem comes in. Sin comes in. It's usually because of sin that we want to alter it. Not only this, but he further enforces it by verse 7, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother. He's talking to Adam and Eve. There wasn't even a father and a mother yet, right? But he is establishing a pattern and a standard for all of generations to follow. This is how it's supposed to look. And it's not supposed to look any other way. See, anything outside of this confine is sin. The term immorality embraces everything that is outside of this relationship between one male, one female for life. That's God's intent. That's where we need to start the discussion. On anything else, if we want to talk about marriage, divorce, or any problems in marriage, we need to go back to the beginning. How did God intend it to be? How did He design it? And let's work from there. Let's not start with the concessions first. Because all we're trying to do is we're building a house with a whole bunch of back doors that we can run out. If we start with the intent and go back to the beginning, then we build a house. There's only one door. We walk in through it, we leave the same way, and we do it together. And there's no easy way out. This is interesting that he uses these terms, male and female. And Jesus is quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Just think about this, male and female. Not man and woman. He could have used andros, which is male, gunaikos, which is woman. But no, he uses male and female. Not only that, but neither of these have the article. In other words, he's dealing with maleness and femaleness. Well, what's the point? He's making a distinction between the sexes. And they are rooted in the creative will of God, and they are the foundation for marriage, for the human family, and for the human species. You see, to alter this, right, and there is the thought that somehow those who embrace the homosexual way of life are somehow more pro-dignity of humanity and the human species. That's not true. That way of life is destructive. It would bring an end to the human species if left unto itself. God's design is one male, one female for life. That's it. That is the foundation for marriage. That is the foundation for the human family. That is the foundation for human species. That is the foundation for society. That is why that is the first institution by God. The reason why we have such a collapse in society around us, it starts here in the home. When we have fathers who are not fulfilling their roles as husbands and fathers to the children and leaders in the home, and they abdicate that, and we have a breakdown in the household, we have a breakdown in society. It's the foundation for every society everywhere. So to me, this issue here is a non-negotiable one. And when the law changed, then I met with some dear brothers in Christ last Sunday, and we said, all right, what do we do in response to this? Because we cannot view things the same. Just can't. Their distinctive constitution, physical constitution, made each of them a complement to the other. It fitted them for each other. This is the way that God designed it. Trying to explain to my oldest son the birds and the bees, right? Having that talk, I dreaded that one. Whew. Right? You use the analogy of the lampstand, right? You take the light plug and plug it into the socket, you have electricity, right? That's how it works. End of the conversation. No more talking about it. And don't ask me until your night of your honeymoon. Then I'll tell you what happens, you see? You cut off the prongs and go to stick it in the plug, nothing, right? It's obvious to us. It's absurd that anyone would think it's any other way. But see, that's the blindingness of sin. It's what it does to us. And it affects the church. When we take something that is so clear from God, so clear in nature, so clear in the Word of God, and we just hand it away to the world, we can't do that. We just can't do that. I mean, when does it stop? You see what I'm saying? When does it stop? What are we going to end with? Before you know it, we're handing away the truth of Christ and the cross. When we do that, we've got nothing. The union of male and female in marriage results in one flesh, a new creation, if you will, no longer two, but one. This is such a beautiful truth. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. I just tell you, we have the little phrasing, we like it because it's just so gitchy, whatever. Leave and cleave, right? Let me just tell you, leave is not an appropriate translation. It just isn't. You see, leave has something to do with moving, geographical location. So when, I marry my wife, I'm supposed to leave my parents' home and move way, way far away from them. That's marriage, you see. And unless you actually move away from your family and your parents, then you're not really married, some would say. This term, no, it's better translated forsake. Forsake your father and your mother and cleave to your wife. For their society, they didn't move away. Typically what they did was they added a room onto the parents' house, and the wife would move in with her husband into his parents' home. This was the same in almost every society. Roman society, Pompeii, when the archaeologists went and they discovered Pompeii and they were finding all these houses and homes, they found many of these homes that were designed to which they would have several families living under one roof. Jewish society, they either moved in the house with the parents or they moved right next door. They didn't move away from them. It wasn't an issue of leaving. It wasn't a geographical movement. It had to do with emotional and psychological. You see, you can live on the other side of the U.S., but if you're in constant contact with your mom and dad over the phone, what's the distance? The influence is still there. I just say this to you, this is an aside, but it's dealing with what's here. But just tell you, we know we have spillover from our lives. We all know this, right? Whether you're raised good or bad, we all have spillover. And it's going to happen. When you get married, it's going to spill over into your marriage. It just does. And it can be good and it can be bad. The reality of it is that when a man and woman leave the household, and here dealing with the man, if he leaves his father and mother and he's going to join himself to his wife, you see they're starting a new family. Their own way of doing things, their own existence. Not completely separated, but you understand what I'm saying? They're going to have their own identity as a family. And they need to be allowed that freedom to do that. But there's spillover. So I'll use the analogy. Tom and Susie. Tom and Susie get married. Tom's mom, she would do his laundry for him. She would make his bed. She would cook him his meals. And she would keep house. So Tom marries Susie. And Susie does the same thing. She washes his clothes. She makes his bed. She does his laundry. And she keeps house. But she doesn't do it like Tom's mom did. It's different. You see, my mom, Tom, she used to take the socks and fold them in a certain way, right? And do it in a certain way, right? But Susie doesn't do that. Or Tom's mom, she didn't like dust bunnies, so she'd get under that bed and vacuum and do everything right all the time, make sure there was no dust bunnies. Susie, on the other hand, they're more like dust bears. She really doesn't care what's under the bed as long as you don't see it. You see, those things spill over into our marriage. But here's the problem. Tom starts looking at Susie a little bit different. She's not like my mom, and she doesn't do it like my mom did it, right? And now all of a sudden, Tom is trying to stay married to his mom and his wife at the same time. You can't do that. You cannot become one flesh if you do not forsake your father and your mother. Susie, she grew up a certain way. Her parents did certain things, right? And so this is how their household went. Susie gets married to Tom, and all of a sudden Susie's parents are trying to tell her how their household should be. You need to tell Tom he needs to do this. Well, your dad was out there watering the lawn every day and mowing it every weekend. Well, you know what? For Tom, that's not a priority, and he really doesn't care what his yard looks like. Spillover. We all do this. Hopefully you'll have parents who are wise enough that when you get married, they'll just let you be your family. But see, we have spillover. It can be negative. What if your dad, abandoned Susie? Or maybe he was verbally abusive to Susie and harsh to her, right? That's going to spill over into the marriage. See, when Tom has to work late several nights in a row, for Susie, that abandonment issue is going to start coming to the surface. Forsake your father and your mother. It's not leave geographically. It is more of an emotional and psychological separation. And it is relative, not absolute. This doesn't mean you don't have ties with your family, but you got to understand, when a husband and wife go off on their own, they are starting their own household, and they need to be left to do that. And they're going to do things differently.